on the internet. If you're watching this at Creative Live TV, I get your questions and comments first. If you click the live chat button in the upper right-hand corner, or if you're on YouTube or Facebook or any other platforms, I do see your comments, maybe 30 seconds delayed. But please share your thoughts and questions with our guest today, because I know that you're here for him and not me. So I'm going to do my part to get out of the way. But I want to call our attention to the fact that we are in an era where digital skills, they get a lot of attention, and rightly so. There's a lot of argument in support of that. But another POV is emerging where those skills might only have a shelf life equal to the latest fad or the latest gadget, whereby true human skills, and these are skills that are often possessed by mid-career workers, things like good judgment, specialized knowledge, and the ability to collaborate, coach, and mentor, where these things, they never expire. So enter our guest, Rebel hospitality entrepreneur, New York Times bestselling author. Man, I'm very excited. We've been navigating this conversation for some time here. We're happy to have him. This is Mr. Chip Conley. Disrupted his favorite industry twice, 26, when he founded Joie de Vivre Hospitality, transforming an inner city motel into the second largest boutique hotel brand in America. He then sold that after being its CEO for 24 years, which we can talk about that arc as an entrepreneur, only to then join Airbnb as head of global hospitality and strategy for 4 years, and today acts as the strategic advisor for hospitality and leadership. We have had Joe Gebbia, co-founder of Airbnb, on before. It was a very popular episode. What is especially exciting to me about this episode is the emphasis and the focus on mentorship, on leadership, on there's so many, our marketing here at Creative Live is very splashy. It's about, hip creators learning new things. And you know what? There's so many in our audience are mid-career workers. And this episode is specifically here to help those folks and inspire all the other folks who don't know what they're missing. So please, wherever you are in the world, and I'm seeing your names and locations tick in from on my Facebook feed here, from all over the world, please tap your keys or give a shout out, raise your hands for Mr. Chip Conley in the house. Chip, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chase. I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, congrats on a lot. You've had enough career success for several lifetimes. One of the ways that I was interested in starting two different forks I wanted to explore as at the front end of the show here. One is retracing some of your history for the folks who are not into the hospitality or hotelier universe that you have created.
Your French is pretty good, Chase. Your French is pretty good.
Désolé, je ne parle pas bien français.
Yes, and
just un petit peu. But that's one. I want to retrace, your steps in that industry.
Yes.
But also where you came up with this idea that mentorship and that now is such a critical time. There's a lot of people that are feeling lost, and a lot of we're looking for leaders in a lot of places, and not a lot of people are showing up for some. So these seem to be at opposite ends of your career arc. So we might as well take the left-hand one first. Tell us a little bit about your early career and how you got started, and then we'll move over to the other point.
Sure. Yeah. Someone recently said to me, Chip, you went from boy wonder to modern elder. How the hell did you do that? I went to college and graduate school at Stanford, got my business school, got my MBA there. And a couple of years later, at age 26, I started a boutique hotel company. Now, it was way early. It was the only two people who had really started boutique hotels before that in the U.S. were Ian Schrager and Bill Kimpton. And it was a motel in the Tenderloin that I still own 34 years later. It's called the Phoenix, funky motel. Nice. Pay by the hour motel. The biggest, corporate account for that place when I got it was Vinny and his girls. So you know what kind of place it was. Very popular at lunchtime. Over the course of the next 24 years, I rode the wave, the boutique hotel wave, which was a pretty big wave, quite honestly, and was able to create 52 unique hotels, each with its own different brand and identity, all in California. I was very conscious about wanting to be the largest independent hotelier in the state of California, and we were by far the largest. And I loved it till I hated it. And maybe we'll get to that in a few minutes.
Yeah.
But I loved it till I hated it. And I sold it in the Great Recession. I sold the brand and the management company. I didn't sell the real estate, so I still owned a bunch of hotels, the real estate of the hotels. And then it was a couple years later that if you've seen the movie The Intern, Chase.
Oh yeah.
So Robert De Niro, Anne Hathaway. At some point, Robert De Niro says, "Musicians don't retire; they quit when there's no more music left inside of them." So I actually knew that I had some music left inside of me. I just wasn't sure who to share it with. And it was about that time that Brian Chesky reached out to me and said, "Will you be my mentor? Will you be the in-house mentor and the head of global hospitality and strategy? And will you help us democratize hospitality?" And at that point, Airbnb was a relatively small tech firm in San Francisco, not a person in the company with a hospitality or travel industry background. And the only entrepreneurs in the house were basically a couple people who had started tech companies. So it was a great opportunity to join. And quickly I learned I was the intern as much as I was the mentor. So we'll come back to that. But I realized I wasn't the know-it-all. I had to learn it all as well because I'd never worked in a tech company and I was 52 years old and twice the age of the average employee in the company.
Wow. Well, so there's a couple of different arcs there. Obviously, there's the arc of you as entrepreneur, and then, as you said, from boy wonder to mentor, and themes of reinvention. This combination, this word that you coin in the book, which if you're just tuning in, I'm sitting down with Chip Conley, and we're here talking about a lot of things, but one of which most recently is Wisdom at Work, which you can see my copy right there. It looks like I've owned it for 6 months and I've owned it for about 8 days. Just a beautiful book. And these, part of the ethos around creativeLIVE is pursuing your dreams in career and hobby and in life. And you have exemplified those in many ways. And I want to hear a little bit about how you got started in hospitality, because so many of our people want to find out how to apply themselves in an area where they have a lot of energy and where, not to be cliche, but if you're going to do something and do it well, it might as well be an area that you're interested in. And how did you discover your interest and passion in this area? Because that is a huge stumbling block for so many of our listeners and watchers.
What's interesting, Chase, is that I went to Stanford Business School. I graduated quite young. I was 23 when I graduated from business school. So Seth Godin and I were the two youngest people in our class. We were closest friends in business school, and still are very close. And I knew I wanted to go into real estate. So I was focused on commercial real estate. And what was clear to me after about a year of being in commercial real estate development in San Francisco is that it was a dog-eat-dog world, and it was a bit of a zero-sum game. So the negotiation you do at an office building with an office tenant, it didn't feel like it was a win-win. And so, interestingly, two things happened at the same time. Number one is I started having people come visit me in San Francisco who I'd gone to college or high school with or graduate school with. And they never stayed in a hotel. They always stayed on my couch. So I had a little focus group of one each time, like, why are you not staying in a hotel? And the thing I kept hearing was that hotels in San Francisco are expensive and boring. And so that was one thing. And then secondly, our small maverick commercial development company that I was working for decided we were going to potentially do a hotel in San Francisco. And so I was in charge of the feasibility study of that. And as I learned more about the business and I could see the early stages of boutique hotels taking off, I was fascinated by it because it was a win-win. I mean, instead of it being dog eat dog, it was more like, God, if you treat people well, actually you do better in business. So that's why I called the company Joie de Vivre, which means joy of life in French, because that is our mission statement, or that was our mission statement. It is still the company's mission statement. It's now a Hyatt company, owned by Hyatt. And I said, okay, I'm going to go out and quit my job, and I'm going to, earn a salary of $2,000 a month, which I did for 3 years. At $2,000 a month, basically $72,000 over a 3-year period, which is not what a Stanford MBA usually is earning 2.5 years out of business school.
Wow.
But I loved it. I really loved the business. What I realized is my creativity, my appreciation for design, My natural tendency to be a host and to like to make people feel good. I went to high school in the inner city of LA, Long Beach, it's called Long Beach Poly High School, Snoop Dogg's high school. So I knew what it was like to be the other. And so I knew what it meant to be empathetic to other people. And I had sort of spent my lifetime learning how to ingratiate myself with other people in a way that made them feel comfortable, and made myself feel comfortable as well. And so I just was being a boutique hotelier was really easy. I think that in your work you can have one of three relationships with it. It's either a job, a career, or a calling. And I would highly recommend to those of you listening, find the calling. And the calling is usually something that gets you in that state of flow, that Mahali Csikszentmihalyi state of flow, where you lose track of time. Abraham Maslow called it being self-actualized. And you are doing it because it feels like there's almost a bigger force than you that is helping fuel your talent. And when you are living your calling, you're sort of on an anesthetic. You don't have a very high pain threshold. You don't feel pain. And that's why it was really weird, Chase, when for 22 years, that's how it felt. And I went through the dot-com bust and 9/11 and that whole terrible period. But we tripled in size, even though we were very vulnerable as particularly a very strongly Bay Area oriented company. And at the end of the day, it was the Great Recession that was my wake up call, the wake up call for this hotelier that said, listen, I actually don't want to do this anymore.
Wow.
And I went from calling, I missed career. I went from calling to job. It was like, there's no dimmer on this switch. It just went from, lights on to lights off. And that's a hard thing to happen when you are the face of the company. Richard Branson wrote the first I've written 5 books. My first book was called The Rebel Rules. And Richard Branson wrote the foreword. And I remember having a conversation with him once where he said to me, he was a little bit of a mentor to me. And he said, the moment you start losing the passion for the businesses that you are not just owning or concepting, but you're actually running them, is the moment you start running for the door, and you've got to figure out a solution. And that was really hard during the Great Recession because nobody wanted to buy a boutique hotel management company during that time when everything was in free fall. But I was able to get to a better place, and it was almost exactly 10 years ago. In fact, 10 years ago this month that I sold. And that was a hard thing. What I will say is that one of the things that a lot of people really underestimate, especially if you're an entrepreneur, is how tightly wound that identity is to you. It feels like a Band-Aid you have to rip off when you are selling your company. The identity of being the face of the company, and in my case, I had 3,500 employees, being mama and papa bear for that company. I was the founder, CEO. I didn't have a co-founder. I didn't have a co-CEO. I was it. And it really was a lot of my identity, because from age 26 to 50, that's sort of what I knew. But the thing was, the fact that I had 2 years to ponder it during the time I was trying to sell the company.
Yeah.
And it was all really quite private. Not very many people knew that I was trying to sell the company. That helped me to spend 2 years preparing myself for a life without that identity. And there are a lot of entrepreneurs who don't do that proper the preparation to realize that leaving that identity leaves you in a place where sometimes you feel a little bit naked and lost.
The concept of identity, it's amazing that you said that as the perfect lead in, because so many people identify with their career and their job, and it's a place to hang your hat. And especially in the States, what do you do is such an early conversation starter, for better or for worse. But the concept of tying our identity to how we spend our time is at the crux of what I find fascinating about your work. Most recently, the book Wisdom at Work is this idea of reinvention. And for so many people who are watching and listening, there's a couple different paths. They left school and they did the thing that their parents want them to do, and that society and culture told them to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. And then they've got to this point where they realize that they've got one precious life, and that they're living a life that someone else, around a script that someone else has written. Yeah. And then the other is someone who maybe had a great run, as you did with Joie de Vivre, but the flame has has gone away. And in both those cases, regardless of which camp you may find yourself in, reinvention is at the core. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the process that you went through to reinvention. And you talked about it in the book, and I've heard other interviews where you basically just say, oh well, Brian called me, but there had to be some internal thinking about what was the right opportunity and what was I cut out for, and if just help us understand your mindset, and B, some of the tactics that you went through. Again, A, mindset, B, tactics that you went through in order to monitor or support or foster your reinvention of yourself as a business person.
Well, I think if the number one thing I would just say is be curious. I mean, curiosity is the elixir for creativity and innovation, and frankly, it's the elixir for life. One of my heroes is Peter Drucker, management theorist who wrote 2/3 of his 40 books after the age of 65. And every 2 years, he would study a new subject that had nothing to do with being a business professor, because like Japanese ikebana, flower arranging, or medieval war strategies. And he would become one of the world's leading experts on it, because what he knew was that sort of passionate engagement and curiosity about life actually fueled his whole way of being. So I would say that the thing that I got when I sort of unleashed myself, got my get out of jail free card from working 70 hours, 60 hours a week in my company, was I was particularly curious about emotions and about festivals. And so I actually went and did a deep dive on both. And I ended up writing a book called Emotional Equations that did really well. And it was because I wanted to understand my own emotions, because when I was that CEO silently, suffering through the Great Recession, and wanting not to do it anymore, and felt like I was reading Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's famous book, because I felt like I was in a concentration camp of my own mind. So the process of learning about my emotions helped me to understand, okay, wow, the emotions run through you. It's when you actually hold on to them, or you're unconscious about them. Carl Jung, the psychologist, really, I believe he didn't never say this. This is Chip Conley saying it, but I get this from him, which is, I think wisdom is all about learning how to take the unconscious and make it conscious. And for me, I wanted to do that with my emotions. And then I was fascinated by festivals. I was a founding board member of Burning Man. And so I was really curious about creating a website, which was called Fest 300, of the 300 best festivals in the world, and an annual list. So we have a Fortune 500, a Forbes 400, and a Fest 300. And I love that. I figured, okay, that makes for an interesting life. I just get to go around the world, do all kinds of festivals and pilgrim, all kinds of interesting things. But I think what I did was the curiosity mindset, and the sense of like, okay, I'm not done. And I'm not living on the laurels of what I've done in the past. We all know, you go to that high school reunion, and the jock, high school quarterback, is still telling his stories about whatever happened in high school. And he's now 400 pounds, and his best times are behind him. And so I think one of the things that's fascinating is, Chase, is you're 48 years old. And the question I would ask you is, what percentage of your adult life do you think is still ahead of you? Just guess.
Well, adult, I feel like I just became an adult, so my answer would be 100. But let's just say I believe that I will live to be 120 years old based on some of the conversations I've had here. But so I got 50 years of goodness.
No, yeah, you should wait. You got more than 50 years, because if you're 48, you've got 30 years of adulthood behind you. If you start counting at age 18, if you live till 120, you have 72 years ahead of you. So 30 behind, 72 ahead. Well, you have 70%. You have 70% of your adulthood still ahead of you.
Yes.
Most of us don't do that math. So I was doing that math, and I was saying, and I'm 59 now, I turn 60 later this year. Some longevity sites have said I'm probably going to live till I'm 98. So if I live till I'm 98, I have, at age 59, I have just entered the second half. I just finished halftime, just starting the second half of my life, second half of my adult life, my post 18 years old. All of that led me to a place of having a growth mindset. Yeah. And then, Carol Dweck has talked about fixed and growth mindset. So fixed mindset is when you tend to be focused on improving yourself, and success is defined by winning. A growth mindset is when you're focused on improving yourself, and success is defined by learning. And so as you get older, if you have a fixed mindset, what you tend to do is your sandbox gets smaller and smaller, because there's things you can't do like you used to be able to do, especially physically. And so I got to the point of realizing my future will be better than my past only if I have a growth mindset. So at age 59, I'm learning Spanish, and I'm learning how to surf, and I'm learning how to cook, and so I'm learning things that I feel an idiot at these things. But what I learned from my experience at Airbnb was I would have run for the hills a month into it if I hadn't had a growth mindset, because my way of being historically was I was the CEO of the company. My ego was big. I was used to being the sage on the stage, not the guide on the side. And I needed to actually right size the ego, realize that I was there for the 3 founders to help mentor them to create a great company and to make them great leaders. And I'm really proud all these years later that the 3 of them are still together, which is, I don't know if
Incredible.
there's ever been a company that's hit this kind of valuation that's had 3 founders that are still actively involved in the business. But I also had to realize that I needed to have a beginner's mind, because there were so many things I needed to learn. And often the relationship I had with Brian, who I was mentoring, but he was also my boss, was one of mutual mentorship.
Well, mutual mentorship is obviously a big piece. You talked about, being a mentor and an intern at the same time. That's like, if we're exploring mindset still, like, how does one have that? Because most people come from the attitude of, how do you, is it just a parting of the ego, or parting ways with the ego? How can you both have this beginner's mindset, and a leader at the same time?
Brian and I have, as when he once said on stage, he said we have our synapses fire together, and so but his knowledge and my knowledge were very different. He said to me, about 2 months into it, he said, "We hired you for your knowledge, but what we've really gotten is your wisdom." And I'd never really known what the difference was. But what we offered each other was the following. First of all, we both tried to be humble. And that was, that was something that you don't think of a Brian Chesky necessarily as a humble guy, because, he had to go out and raise money from venture capitalists, and he needed to go out and have all that confidence. But the thing underneath, for those people who know Brian, he's actually a relatively humble person one-on-one, and in terms of knowing that he wants to learn from other people. So he's got that growth mindset and that desire to be curious about what he doesn't know yet. For him, what I was able to teach him was a lot around EQ and around leadership. So some of the qualities that you get better at as you get older, because it's weird, the venture capitalists and private equity firms sort of expect these young, brilliant technologists to miraculously embody the relationship wisdoms and leadership skills that those of us who've been around a little bit longer have had decades to learn. But so I taught him a little bit EQ. He taught me a lot of DQ, digital intelligence. And I got to say, I was digitally, not only in terms of the tools I used, was I a bit of a dunce, but I didn't understand what even product was.
Yeah.
The first time I heard the word product at Airbnb, I thought the product was our homes and our apartments. Like, no, Chip, the product is our website. And so I had to learn not just the lingo, but the way of thinking of how you scale a global network effects company, which is what Airbnb was and is. In a way, and that's why it's so funny. Like 2 months into it, he originally just asked me to be the head of hospitality, but 2 months into it, he said, "You're now in charge of strategy." And I said, "Well, that's interesting, because I've never worked in a tech company before, and I'm head of strategy for a tech company." Good, but it was an amazing experience. And what I learned also is that it's valuable to intern publicly and mentor privately. And what does that mean? It meant when I needed to give Brian some feedback about how he was running a meeting, of course, I never gave it in the middle of the meeting, the executive committee meeting. I did that privately, and I did that privately with my own team, with my team as well. I had about 100 mentees at Airbnb, and frankly, every one of them mentored me as much as I mentored them. But what I tried to do publicly was to just ask questions. And initially, I thought I was an idiot by asking questions, but then I sort of realized that Socrates, sort of famous for asking questions a long time ago, and that you could ask catalytic questions to help the company and maybe leaders see their blind spots. And then I would, save the mentoring for a one-on-one with someone. So, that's how it worked. And I've had the good fortune of doing that with Marion Goodell, who's the CEO of Burning Man, being on the board there, having the one-on-one with her as opposed to saying something at a board meeting. And same with Gavin Newsom, because Gavin was a good friend of mine who became mayor of San Francisco. I helped to make him mayor, and he asked me to be his consigliere. Basically the guy who hung out with him as his mentor in room 200 in City Hall at San Francisco. And now he's the governor of California. So, and there's a bunch of other folks I've had the good fortune of helping to mentor. And I've got to say, the older you get, the more this statement from Erik Erikson, a developmental psychologist, makes sense. He said, "I am what survives me." And that's really what, if you have kids, that's how you think about your kids. If you have a company or you've written a book, that's what you think about that. But when it comes to the people that you have actually influenced in terms of their skills as leaders or as entrepreneurs, that's you get such a high from that. I was very, very proud of Brian in this pandemic with how he handled a very difficult situation with having to lay off all of his contractors and 25% of the workforce, almost 2,000 people. And so it's that you feel a bit like the proud papa when you see something like that.
Well, I'm curious if you think this idea of being curious and being willing to be an intern and bring to the table the mentorship skills that you have, is this something that every middle career person should be thinking about, that you have skills that you can offer and that you need to have this, this growth, learning, curious mindset? How important is this skill of developing this relationship between internship and mentor for anyone who's trying to reinvent themselves?
Chase, we live in a time where we're going to live longer than our parents. Power seems to be moving younger, and the world is changing faster. And those three variables have got a lot of people in midlife really bewildered and feeling irrelevant. And so what I call it same seed, different soil. That was my experience at Airbnb. Same seed, it was me, and actually same industry, it was hospitality, very different read on hospitality. But I was able to come into a disruptive company and help them understand the landscape, help them understand the leadership, help them actually take what was a very niche-oriented business that was sort of millennial budget urban travel and take it mainstream, turn it into a global hospitality brand. And I didn't do that by myself. That was a whole team of us. But I was really the only hospitality person there. So I certainly had a lens that was different than everybody else's. And I would just say that process, I was gifted because at 52, I was tapped on the shoulder. There's a lot of people right now who've lost their job who are 52 who are thinking, what the hell? This extra longevity, it sucks. If how do you pay for it?
Right.
So that's part of the reason I think anybody can do it. I think it has to do with getting curious, learning. I think a modern elder versus a traditional elder is as much curious as they are wise. The curiosity opens up possibility, and the wisdom distills down what's essential. And those two qualities together in the same person can be very valuable. But we live in an era that's somewhat ageist, and in certain industries, tech, advertising, generally marketing, fashion, entertainment industry, professional sports, after about age 35 in a lot of those industries, you actually feel like you're a little over the hill. So part of my crusade is to not just figure out how do we create more modern elders out there, but actually how do we help companies to see the value of it. And there's a few studies that have recently come out that shown that we've known for a long time that diversity is valuable in companies, but the focus on diversity has usually been gender, race, and sexual orientation. There's growing evidence that age diversity is the number one variable for effective diversity in companies. Why? Because a younger brain and an older brain usually operate a little differently. And so you get that diversity on a team, which actually allows for different points of view and a lack of groupthink. So, yeah.
I want to put a pin in team and come back to that because this is another huge theme in the book. There's, again, I got a bunch of underlines and pages turned over about the role and the value of team as the ultimate disruptor. But before we go to team, I want to circle back on the idea of the modern elder. Now, I know that you have the academy, and it's a little bit tough right now because we're in the middle of a pandemic.
Right.
But just this idea that, midlife, mid-career deserves its own set of reflections and rituals, and that in a previous world, maybe a world of manual labor, that you needed to rest after working for 40 years. But as you said, the quote about, was it De Niro with, you stop playing music when there's no more music inside you. And you've clearly got a lot of music, and so do so many others. So help us understand your vision for the modern elder.
Yeah. So we have an interesting situation like never before. We have 5 generations in the workplace for the first time. That includes the great generation. So if you're in your 70s, you're probably, you're probably great generation. Some people are boomers in their early 70s. But so with people in a place where they're going to be living and working longer, either by choice or necessity, what we need to do is learn how to bring almost like an intergenerational potluck to the table. So that's part of the reason why I decided I wanted to create the Academy. So Modern Elder Academy, it's also known as MEA, is 1 hour north of Cabo San Lucas in the southern Baja Peninsula of Mexico. So it's only a 2-hour flight from LA. And it's the world's first midlife wisdom school. It's a social enterprise, so I don't pay myself a dime. I've built the full campus, not getting any rent, because what I wanted to do was give back. I wanted to say, listen, I know people who've committed suicide in midlife, and there's the suicide midlife suicide rate today is 50% higher than it was in the year 2000, because a lot of people
50%.
Wow. Yeah, a lot of people feel irrelevant. What I wanted to do was say, what if you created a place where people actually cultivated and harvested their wisdom, and they were able to same seed, different soil, able to see how to repurpose that mastery that they've learned, that they don't even realize the value in it. And then how do you actually take it out to the world and confidently market yourself, or even go out and become an entrepreneur in your 50s, let's say, and which is the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurs in the United States is people in their 50s. And actually, frankly, it's been shown many times now that actually if you're in your 50s, your likelihood of success is higher than if you're in your 20s. So long story short is what we're trying to do is address the confidence crisis and also create some matchmaking of younger people who have a lot to bring to the table and older people who do as well. And instead of seeing it as a generational war, see it as a generational opportunity. And so it's been, and Google showed in their study, the Project Aristotle study, that the number one variable for teams, to go back to teams for a moment, was psychological safety. And there's all this evidence that actually psychological safety is improved by age diversity on a team, and gender diversity, because frankly, you get a bunch of 27-year-old guys in a room, all of whom have their own idea of how things are supposed to be, and you're missing collaboration. Put some women in the room, put some people of color in the room, put some gay or lesbian people in the room, and put some older people in the room. And what you do is you get a collection of ideas. But what the older people do is they create the psychological safety, because one of the things that is very evident in social studies, social research, is that as we age, we get a little bit more emotionally moderate. We're able to control our reactions. Viktor Frankl famously said in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is your power to choose your response. And in your response lies your growth and your freedom. And as you get older, you move from reaction to response. And again, I'm generalizing here, so be careful. Be careful with generalizations, but there's a lot of evidence that is true.
In anecdotally, my own life, like my ability to contemplate something, even if it's just a millisecond more, I claim that as a little victory where the younger me would would have reacted, and probably with less balance. Once you've seen that in yourself, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And my wife is a mindfulness teacher, so I get a lot, and I know your long relationship with the Esalen.
Yep.
There's a lot of I think of threads we could pull on there. But in order to be in service of what I said we were going to talk about next, which is teams.
Yes.
Again, so many topics I'd love to go deep with you on, but I can't go past teams because so many of the people who are listening and watching, we at Creative Live attract largely a creator and an entrepreneurial mindset. And so much of the entrepreneur story, the narrative in our culture, is solo creator sets off on a vast journey. And you mentioned Branson's an investor in Creative Live, a friend. He's the first person to tell you that team is at the center of this, despite all these toxic myths that we've got of the lone creator going into the woods. And in Wisdom at Work, you talk about teams as the ultimate disruptor. Say more.
Yeah. When I joined Airbnb, it was a fascinating experience because what I noticed was everybody was trying to be the smartest person in the room. And at one point, someone said to me I was the wisest person in the room. And again, just like when Brian said the difference between knowledge and wisdom, I'd never really seen the difference. But part of what it helped me to see is that when you create an environment where, as I don't remember who, it might have been Harry Truman who said, it's amazing what can get done when it doesn't matter who gets the credit, or no one cares who gets the credit. And I think there's an element in a team that when a team feels like they are firing on all cylinders, it feels better than actually your own personal individual achievement. In rowing or crew, there's actually a word called swing. When the 8 rowers and the coxswain are all in unison, the boat starts to actually elevate in the water a little bit, which means that there's less friction, which means it goes faster. That is a team. A team is in unison and when I say be in unison, it doesn't necessarily mean there isn't conflict. There absolutely is. We as an executive team at Airbnb read Pat Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of Teams, and we did work on that, and we realized that actually having conflict was a good thing, as long as we could align as a group once we had agreed upon what our path was going to be. So we did a ton of work, and part of my role in the company was to help. I set up the learning and development function in the company, and so as to help actually the teams in Airbnb work more effectively, and especially the executive team, which was about 10 or 12 of us. So understanding personality types is a lot of that as well. Understanding, oh my gosh, the difference between an introvert and an extrovert. Or I'm a big fan of the Enneagram, and how do you understand Enneagram types and what that means about the overall pair of glasses that someone is wearing. So there's a lot to it, and there's I can be someone who's impatient by nature. I have a bias for action, classic entrepreneur. One of my co-founders in Modern Elder Academy last week said, "Chip, are you able to fly at the speed of partnership?" And that was really good for me to hear, because it reminded me of the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I realized with my 2 co-founders of the company, and I'm the predominant, one that the world sees, and I'm the one who really came up with the idea, but these 2 are right by my side. I realized I often am so much on my own path about what I think we need to do next, especially in COVID where I don't see them because we're all spread out right now, that I am not in partnership with them. And so knowing again, I said earlier about Carl Jung, making the unconscious conscious is, to me, the ultimate sign of wisdom. And one of the things you get better with as you get older is your own personal pattern recognition, seeing your own patterns. And pattern recognition is a form of wisdom. And so long story short is I was able to see that my teamwork lately hasn't been very good because of my pattern recognition of seeing my bias for action means I'm impatient. means I don't have time to wait around to talk to them about it. So I'm glad I've been able to say, okay, I've been a great team member, and I think I helped create a really great set of teams at Airbnb and the framework for how we thought of teams. But I can at times, at 59 and a half years old, be in a place where I'm not a very good team member as well, and I have to come face to face with that.
That's actually a thing worth peeling back one more layer on. So, you've spoken all over the world about this. You talk, about being an elder, and not just the books you've written on the topic, nor the leadership positions you've held, but what part of the 59-year-old Chip Conley is the scared part that people don't always see on stages or read about in the books? Because that, you seem superhuman when we read your books and we see you on stage, but right now there's someone listening who's 59 years old and has just lost their job. And what would your advice be to that person?
Well, if you believe that your best years are behind you, you're answering your own question. So part of what's been fascinating for me to move from lifelong learning to what I now call long life learning, the emergence of long life learning, understanding how to create a life that is as deep as it is long, and that's really what Modern Elder Academy is all about, is to recognize and study the social research on this, social science research on this. The U-curve of happiness is fascinating. It's across all cultures. It's gotten a lot of press in the last 5 years. What it's shown is that from about age 22 to 25 till around 45 to 50, sorry that you're right in the middle of it, Chase, you see this long, slow decline in life satisfaction or happiness for a lot of reasons. It's the mashup of all the responsibilities, all the identities, all of the things that you have on your plate, including kids often. Kids don't make you happy, but they give you meaning. lots of research on that. So what happens around 45 to 50 is if the equation disappointment equals expectations minus reality is relevant here, you actually often around this age and you're around 50, you start shifting your expectations. You also start to shift out of the primary operating system being your soul to the primary operating system being your ego to the primary operating system being your soul. Now that gets pretty woo-woo, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of that right now, but what I can say is there's a lot of evidence that people actually start to move beyond their own petty needs, and they start to actually get happier. And what's weird about the U-curve of happiness is that people in their 50s are happier than their 40s, 60s happier than 50s, 70s happier than 60s, and women in their 80s happier than 70s. And so what I would say to that 59-year-old who's lost their job, who feels like maybe, their life is over, do the math on what percentage of your adult life is still ahead of you. Get curious. Brush off your wisdom and mastery and have someone help you, whether it's a coach, whether it's coming here to MEA, whether it's your best friend who knows your qualities maybe better than you do, and go out there and start to look for the thing that you most are curious about and what could be a new industry you could go into. It doesn't have to be the same industry. Again, your skills you have, human skills, that pattern recognition, or there's something called crystallized intelligence. It's holistic thinking. As you get older, your ability with memory and how quickly you recall things actually is less. You're less fast, and your memory isn't as good. But what you get better at until about your late 60s is your ability to connect the dots. And connecting the dots is a quality that young people really appreciate in older people, because it actually is the ability to see the pattern before, and to be a futurist, to be able to sort of see the future and be able to then say, okay, if that's the future, this is where we should go. So I would just say you probably have a lot more going for you. But as you go look for a job at age 59 or 52 or 48, Chase, in case you lose your job at 48, what you've got to do is you've got to actually find a habitat that's going to be right for you. And one of the qualities that you get better at as you get older is environmental mastery. And this has nothing to do with the ecology. It means you actually know the habitats in which you flourish. And so you are very readily able to determine pretty quickly whether a particular company and culture are right for you.
And does that just come from experience? Does that come from meeting a lot of people? Where does that intuition come from?
So intuition comes from pattern recognition and wisdom, and the intuition comes from the lived experience and what you've learned over time. One of the practices that I started doing at age 26 that relates to what we're talking about here, that I would recommend to anybody at any age. So if you're listening to this and you're 23 years old right now and saying, who the hell is this guy at 59? Well, here's something you can start doing at age 23. At age 26, when I started my hotel company, I had no background or experience in hotels. And about 3 months into it, I realized I was up shit creek. I had no idea what I was doing. And so I actually took a journal, an empty journal, and I wrote on the cover, my wisdom book. This is a true story, my wisdom book. And every Saturday or Sunday, Friday afternoon or Saturday or Sunday, each week for 30 minutes, I would actually put together a list of about 3 to 6 bullet points of what I learned that week. Typically things where I had a bad experience and I had to learn from it. And so whether that was the wrong kind of partner in business, an investor, or whether that was how I ran a meeting badly, or how I gave a direct report, a review that just didn't go well, and how I could have done it differently. I've been doing that now for almost 34 years, and I have 9 wisdom books. And actually, during the Great Recession, I went back to look at my .com bust 9/11 ones because I was like, okay, I think I had some learning back there that I need to go back to. So what I'm just saying is, whether it's environmental mastery and understanding what it is, what habitats you flourish in, what kinds of people you work best with, what time of day you're best at, you're at your best. These are the kinds of things you learn over time, and but it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're older, you're wiser, because there's lots of people who are older who don't cultivate and harvest their wisdom, nor do they have an open mind about learning new things, or nor are they curious. So you could be wiser at age 30 than someone who's at age 60. But it's all about cultivating and harvesting that wisdom.
Well, we mentioned early on in our conversation the timing of all of this, and now we need guidance more than ever. And there's, I don't know too many people who are alive for the 1918 pandemic. So the reality is that subset of leadership is pretty small. But this concept of leading through crisis is not new, right? You've mentioned several crises in the arc of your entrepreneurial career. But let's just flip the script now, because we've taken the approach that if you are mid-career, middle-aged, looking for another restart, whether it's something you're passionate about, or you talked a lot about pulling on the curiosity threads to see an area. You talked about environmental awareness and mastery. Let's flip the script and say you are a young person and you have found yourself in a tough spot. What is a good, what's some guidance that you would give us for turning to people who might be great mentors? How should you find them, cultivate them, and where to look?
Couple thoughts. First of all, I have a daily blog, and I write a lot about this in the daily blog, which is called Wisdom Well. It's on the Modern Elder Academy website, and so it's just you can sign up for it. It's free, and you just get an email each day with a little microdose of wisdom. And I want to say 2 things on this. Number one is, what I'm hearing a lot from people of all ages right now is a lot of anxiety about where things are in an uncertain world. And if you go to the Wisdom Well blog, you'll see there's a post, a very short. All the posts are relatively short because they're daily. There's a post called the Anxiety Balance Sheet. And I would highly recommend people look at that if you're feeling some anxiety about your workplace right now, or just your career or your life, because there's really 2 primary ingredients in anxiety. It's uncertainty and powerlessness. And so the key is to do a balance sheet that helps you to see what do you have some certainty about, and what do you have some influence over. And if you can if you can actually up the ante on both of those, it helps you with the things that you feel uncertain and powerless about. So moving on to mentorship. First of all, if you can find someone that you can teach as well, a mutual mentorship relationship, that's dynamite. That's like the best thing you can get, because then it's a relationship of reciprocity. It'll probably last longer, and it'll actually feel more enriching because neither one of you are typecast. We call ourselves mentorns, a mentor and an intern at the same time. I would say look at the people look at the qualities that you want to learn yourself. What are the things that you feel like you really need help with? That's one way to start, and then sort of start with that, and then say, okay, who are people who you admire who exhibit those qualities, whether they're people at work or people in your family life, people, neighbors, friends, etc. Or look at the people who you just admire, the people who are people who are just the kind of people you want to be like when you grow up, so to speak. I'll tell you my story. So about 2 years after, actually no, about 4 years after I started Joie de Vivre, we were getting our second and third hotels, and we ended up with 52 hotels. But second and third, about 4 years into it, and I knew that culture was important. And the company that I was most admired as a in terms of the company culture was Southwest Airlines. And so I tried to call Herb Kelleher, who for 37 years was the CEO of Southwest, to see if I could ask him if he'd be my mentor. And his assistant, his EA, Colleen Barrett, was the one who answered the phone, and she said, no, he can't do that. But if you write him a letter, this is like the early 1990s. If you write him a letter, and maybe you write him once a year, if he really likes you, maybe he'll answer it. It's like writing Santa Claus. So I wrote Herb Kelleher a one-page letter, asked him 3 questions about corporate culture and how they'd grown the culture at Southwest. And 3 weeks later, I got a letter from Herb. And over the course of the next 10 years, once a year, he was my mentor, and I would write him the letter. And here's the part that's the great part of the story. I got to know Colleen better than I got to know Herb. I never had a phone call with Herb. He was my mentor, and I never met him, nor did I ever have a phone call with him. But Colleen ended up becoming a bit of my mentor too. And here's the amazing story. Colleen was his executive assistant, and she went on to becoming the president of Southwest Airlines. His secretary became the president of their company.
Amazing.
And so what I can say about that is don't assume that someone that is far away from you is going to say no. I probably will, because I have a lot of mentees right now. So be careful. But I would say
double-edged sword for giving us this advice here.
When you write a book about mentorship, it's like, oh, you got a lot of people. But be open to trying to reach out to someone who really is you admire. There are qualities about them. And in the world we live in today, which I didn't have back there in that era, we didn't have the internet, you can learn a lot about someone who's no longer living who could become your mentor, because there's speeches, there's blog posts, there's things that they've done in their life, there's books about them, there's books they've written. So you can actually have a mentor and learn about them without actually necessarily having them face to face.
That's huge. And I think there's another takeaway baked in there, which is you received mentorship from her without ever actually contacting them. And yeah. There's so much like what would it be called, baggage in the word mentor. Yeah. Right. But what you're asking these people for is help and advice, and every little piece of help or every little bit of advice. I'm curious on, landing a mentor, even if you don't actually know them.
I would not start with the word mentor. Yeah. It's like popping the M question, like marriage, like date first, go have coffee. Or, in my case with Herb, I didn't ask him. I was calling him to see if he'd be my mentor. When I wrote him, I didn't say the word mentor, because I actually didn't feel like it was a mentor thing, because it was like a once a year letter. But the truth is that actually when you start with the word mentor, it can actually scare someone off, because it makes it sound like it's a really big commitment. And so just start, if you can, by, when someone writes me in the subject headlining, Chip, I've studied you and I really admire you as a leader, I'd like to learn from you, I'll read that email, I promise you, and then I will respond to that email. I probably will say I can't be their mentor, but if they don't say mentor in the thing, I mean, if they don't say mentor in the thing, I will actually do my best to answer a few questions. Because actually I believe in karmic capitalism. What goes around comes around. And that's true in leadership and in management and in business. So, I think just, be willing to go out and ask.
Last comment, question, request for your wisdom is around not retiring, but rewiring.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the idea of retirement is almost a thing of the past? Is it a thing that was really designed around having worked so hard for 50 years at backbreaking work or on an assembly line in a factory environment? Is it going away? And if so, or if not, how should we think about rewiring?
So retirement should be retired. And because there's now a bunch of evidence that shows that retirement increases your mortality rate by about 2 years. And the three things that actually sort of fall apart are your purpose, your community, and your wellness. The purpose and community are pretty obvious because you're no longer working, full time often. The wellness piece people are surprised by because it seems like you'd have more time to go golf or play tennis or whatever. But because you lose the discipline of the workplace, often you lose your discipline throughout your life. So long story short is, I think the idea of retiring is going to go away as people realize that they're going to live a lot longer, and they're going to want to stay actively involved in life.
Spoken. You heard it here. If not first, certainly the loudest and the most well put. I want to give you a shout out. Congrats on the book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. What's the best place? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the Modern Elder Academy, of course, Wisdom at Work. Any other place you mentioned? Say the name of the blog again at the Modern Elder Academy. The Wisdom Well.
Wisdom Well. And I actually post the Wisdom Well blog posts on LinkedIn virtually every day. So if people want to sort of stay in touch, and LinkedIn's probably the best social media tool with me.
And on that platform, you're just Chip Connolly.
That's right.
All right. Thank you so much for showing up in a world that we are going to live a lot longer than ever thought before. And thank you for being a guiding light for so many, an inspiration. And again, your wisdom in the workplace, having reinvented yourself a handful of times, is inspiring as hell. I want to say thanks for being on the show, Chip.
Thank you, Chase. Just an honor to be with you.
All right, everybody. Signing off. Hopefully be with you again tomorrow. Hey guys, what's up? It's Chase Jarvis.